I have mine. Right, I'm here to talk about REIT structuring, and I'm going to be very fast. We've been told to move extremely fast. We have an hour for the 4 of us plus questions. So very quickly, what is REIT structuring? This is a discussion about deciding the form your REIT will take. And we take it that you've decided you're going to go for a REIT. But you're asking yourself, what form will my REIT take? What product am I actually bringing to the market? For who? And how is it going to happen? And how is that product, which I'm going to bring to the market, going to meet my needs? Because remember, you're not a charity. Nobody starts the REIT as a charity. You have business goals. You want to meet those goals. How does a REIT structure you choose meet your goals? Now, in doing that, you have to take into account your constraints. And one of the constraints you must take into account is, of course, the law. What does the law say I should do as a minimum? And those are some of the things I'm going to be saying here. One of the things you're told, you can't come just the way you want, or maybe just the way you are. The Lord allows us to come to him that way, but not the REIT regulations. So what's the minimum I must be? I must be an unincorporated common law trust. So I will not come in as a company. I will not come in as an NGO. I will not come in as a society. I must be an unincorporated common law trust. I must be divided into units. So you set up an unincorporated common law trust, which is divided into units, because it's a unit you're going to ultimately be issuing to the unit holders. And then you must be established under a trust deed. Actually, a trust can be incorporated, can be established without any documentation. But in this case, you must have a trust deed. A REIT trustee, you must have a REIT trustee who is independent of the promoter and the REIT manager. And those are the 3 key participants in setting up a trust, in structuring a trust. The REIT trustee, the REIT promoter, and the REIT manager. And I'm going to show you a borrowed slide which shows that pictorially. Who must be independent? The REIT trustee. The trustee and REIT manager must be licensed by the CMA. So again, you don't just pick anybody you want. You must pick 2 people who are licensed by the CMA as REIT trustee and as REIT manager. The trust deed must specify the term of the trust. Now, this you find is different from companies. Companies, limited liability companies, do not have a lifetime. They have what we call perpetual succession. They are forever. Once they're started, until you wind it up, it can go on forever. In the case of a REIT, it has a timeline. The ILAM one, for example, was 80 years from the time it was established, from 2015, I think. So Raphael is counting down, and on the 79th year, he will decide what to do with the REIT the following year. He can extend it, or he can terminate it at that point. The trust deed, just to bear in mind, is a constitutive document of the REIT. So when you say what are the constitutional documents of a REIT, it is a trustee. The trustee is the one who says who is the founder, who is the trustee, what are the rules about general meetings, and so on and so on. That is a constitution. Now, if you're making an offer, then you come up with a prospectus or an information memorandum. That is your selling document. It's how you make your business case so that people can buy your units. Still talking about the structure, is a few requirements about assets. The title to the assets in a REIT must be in the name of the trustee, not some other person related to the trustee, not you as promoter. They must be in the name of the trustees. Why? Because the trustee is the one who holds the assets on behalf of the investors in the REIT. The other requirement is that the REIT assets must be segregated from the trustees' other assets. Cooperative Bank is going to be announcing its results in a day or 2, I think. They are due to do that. Now, they cannot include in those results the assets of ILAM, IREIT, even though they are the title holders of the assets of ILAM, IREIT, and ACON, and all the other REITs that we have in the market for now. So they must be segregated. Why? So that they are bankruptcy remote. Bankruptcy remote means that should anything happen to the trustee, we are able to recover our assets. And will not be touched by the liquidators, by the creditors of the trustee, should anything happen to the trustee. And of course, all the assets of the REIT must be invested in eligible real estate investments. And just a bit of that discussion on what are the eligible real estate investments. As far as property is concerned, of course, you're allowed to hold it in cash for a certain period and certain amounts, in fixed income securities and so on. But in terms of real estate, first of all, you must be in Kenya. I don't have that in my notes. Our REITs do not invest outside the country. And perhaps I believe the reason for that, and maybe that will change in future, is because already Kenyan land law is complicated enough. Forget about Tanzania and Uganda and Southern Sudan for now. But that is the current rule. So if you're going to invest in property, because you must, what type of property? It can either be freehold property, it can be leasehold property, but if it is leasehold, must have at least 25 years remaining on the leasehold. And of course, you must have a share in the management company. If this is, for example, if you are owning some units in a development, you must be a proportionate shareholder in the management company of that scheme. Or it can be a title under Section of Properties Act. Again, it must have a 25 years residual term, and you must be part of the corporation constituted for purpose of ownership of units. Now, this structure, if this slide looks a bit different from the rest of my slides, is because it is borrowed. And this is just a reminder, actually from Zarova, this is a reminder that REITs are allowed to leverage up to a certain point. I-REITs 35%, D-REITs 65%. You can't go beyond that. I will return this as soon as Zorova demands it. But what was the purpose of borrowing it? To show you pictorially the various parties who are involved and what their role is. We have the fund manager, who is a REIT manager, actually use REIT manager, who manages the REIT. We have institutional capital coming through the fund managers, coming into the REIT. We have the REIT trustee, and we have the REIT management. But the key thing, is that sky blue? The very light blue on top, that is where your money comes. Those are the target people. That is the 1.7 billion that David Wainaina told us about. And by the way, we are very concerned about the number has not been mentioned. The 1.6 trillion number has not been mentioned today, which is a target size of REITs, I think David mentioned it, by 2030. That number, we need to achieve it. The guys in this house, the target of RAC and this whole incubation process is to have REITs worth 1.6 trillion by 2030, and we all want to participate in that. It's going to come from the institutional capital through the fund managers and the individual investors who are going to invest in the REITs. So talking about structure, what kind of structures are there? One key distinction between structures is either a D-REIT or an I-REIT. Now, if you are going to do a REIT in Kenya, you have to decide, am I going as a development and construction REIT, or am I going as an income REIT? And the distinction, I'll be coming to a bit of that, is very simple. As it sounds, development and construction versus income. There are details under that. Am I going in as a restricted or an unrestricted REIT? Now, each of those, of course, has consequences. We were told many years ago, choices have consequences, and so do these selections. You can choose to go as an unrestricted. Ilam Fahari, I-REIT first came to the market as an unrestricted REIT. Many years later, they decided to change tack, and now they are a restricted I-REIT. I'll be commenting a bit on that because there's been a bit of change in the law recently, which makes a bit of nonsense of that distinction. Is it open-ended, an open-ended fund, or is it a closed-ended fund? Open-ended means we can continue collecting money as people come in, very much like a unit trust. You want to invest today into the fund, go to the promoter, to the fund manager, and invest. And we'll tell you tomorrow what the price of that unit is. On and on and on. Every single day it's open for investment. It's investment day. Closed-ended fund has a certain number of units that at any one time are available for purchase, and once you're closed out at the end of the offer, then you can only buy in the secondary market. The funds we've had so far, the REITs we've had so far, are all closed-ended funds. They do have rights issue. They want to expand, to grow bigger, then they can have a rights issue, or they can have a secondary issue, and they can raise additional money. But they're not open for investment into the REIT directly every day. Now, I need to be clear here. If it is listed, whether or it's sitting on the USP, then it's available for you to invest into it by buying from an existing unit holder. If it's open-ended, you buy units from the REIT manager, from the promoter, from the REIT itself. And so it grows on a daily basis in terms of the number of units. I'm sure there's a question around there. I will answer it. Are you going to invest in your structuring again? Remember, you're structuring. Am I going to invest in property directly, or am I going to invest in shares or special purpose companies, or am I going to invest in a combination of both? Again, a structuring question. Why would you want to invest in property directly? Because, first of all, there's somebody selling property directly, and maybe the person selling that has many other properties which they're not selling, and you want to buy that property into the REIT. Why would you want to invest in an SPV? Because perhaps the person you're acquiring them from does not want to sell the property. They want to sell shares in the company that owns the property. And that's the distinction. I believe, again, Isla Myrit, I keep using them as an example because I think I know at least 80% about them. They have a combination of both. Some of their properties are owned through SPVs. Some of the properties are owned directly as properties. Maybe that's not quite accurate. At least one of the properties owned through an LLP, for example. Now, this is all information in the public domain because it was a listed entity and it's a regulated entity. So those are some of the things you're thinking about. And sometimes you find, why would anybody not want to sell a property directly? Because maybe it's owned by a company, and they don't want the money to go into the company. They want the money to go to the shareholders. And it's the shareholders who are selling the shares. There's a whole distinction as to, so these are discussions you have in your structuring, depending on where you're getting your properties, whether you're seeding them in, or whether you're buying them from third parties, and so on. Now, this has an implication on stamp duty. For example, when you buy shares, it's 1% stamp duty. When you buy property, depending on where it is, it's 4% if it's in an urban area. So that already has a cost implication. But it may not depend on you alone. It also depends on the seller. Is your REIT going to be Islamic or non-Islamic? And I believe my colleague here is going to be talking to us about Islamic REITs, but you've got to decide, am I making it specifically acceptable to the Muslim community, or am I not too concerned about that, and I may miss out on Muslim investors, and so on. So the one thing you don't have to worry about, as far as the law is concerned, there's no restriction on what property sector to invest in. It can be as diversified as you want. It can be as specialized or specific as you want. Meaning you can go for retail space, you can go for commercial, you can go for residential, you can mix it all up. But you can choose to specialize depending on, again, on your goals. Remember, you're trying to say what will meet your goal and what is attractive to the market. Right, so just a little bit of this distinction between D and I. Did I say that this is only available in Kenya? It's only in Kenya that we distinguish between development REITs and I REITs. It's our own original composition. Now, does it make a lot of sense? I think it's probably a distinction that whose time has come to get rid of, because it's very restrictive. But when it was started, the Capital Markets Authority felt there was a need to make the distinction because they felt at the time that DREITs, development and construction, is a lot more risk than income REITs, in the sense of you still have all this period before the investors start getting any money, anything can happen, and so on and so on. But we are starting to change that. Now, so if you look at the original regulations, the DREIT can be open-ended or closed-ended, that remains. Now, it was restricted to professional investors only. However, there's been an amendment effected last year, even though the amendment itself contains a mistake. But the idea was, the new rule is, I think those of you who are with us in Naivasha, you remember, the PS investment promised us, we have changed it. They hadn't changed it. They changed it a few weeks after that, and that's when they made the mistake. And I'm not sure whether CMA is here and whether they've noticed that there's actually a mistake in that change. They amended Regulation 16 instead of Regulation 27. And therefore, when you read the amendment, it doesn't really make sense as far as Regulation 16 is concerned. You have to know to apply to Regulation 27. I'm sure the investment secretary will figure that out soon. Now, so under this amendment, it is no longer necessary to restrict investment in DREITs to professional investors. That changes almost everything. The other change in the same, but this one there's no mistake, is that you can now, for offer purposes, at the initial offer, you may offer DREIT units in parcels of between 100,000, of minimum 100,000, up to such level as the issuer may decide. So it's for the issuer to decide what sort of people do I want to come in. I don't have to restrict it to institutional investors. I don't have to ask people to invest more than 100,000 shillings, but I could choose to. I can decide I want people to come in at a minimum of 2.5 million. Then you put that in your offering memorandum, and that becomes your restriction. Or you can decide I'll go for the minimum 100,000 shillings, and that becomes, again, your restriction. Now, in terms of listing, if it is listed, then it will be traded on a board where the minimum requirement is 100,000. Right now, although we don't have a listed REIT, the limit would have been 5 million shillings. Now it's no longer 5 million. Where is 500 million coming from? It's no longer 5 million. It is now 100,000 shillings. That's what I'm saying. There's a bit of nonsense now. It doesn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't make a big difference because in any case, most people would have to trade at 100,000 anyway. Okay? So that is where we are now with the DREIT, IREIT discussion. It really, in terms of restriction, there's very little of it. Now for a DREIT, you must have a clear exit plan. Remember, DREIT is for development and construction. If you're doing it correctly, they will come to an end at some point. You will finish a development. What do you do with it after that? Do you keep it as a small part of the DREIT, which you can, or do you exit by converting the DREIT into an IREIT and follow the rules of the IREIT? Or do you sell to an IREIT? Or do you sell the units and decide, I'll just be a DREIT who finishes and sells, and maybe you have some people who are off-takers from you. So a DREIT, unlike an IREIT, you must have an exit plan. What's your plan? Yes, you finish development and construction. What next? You can start another development, but where will you be making your money? What will you be doing with your completed units? IREIT, this for income. This for leased premises completed. Of course, there's a limit of how much you can have in undeveloped property, 15%. It can be open-ended or closed-ended fund, which I believe we now know what it means. It can be restricted or unrestricted, where restricted is 100,000. If unrestricted, it must be listed. The reason ILAM had to convert to unlisted first is because if they remained unrestricted, they could not delist. So they had to convert first to restricted so as to delist and go seek admission on the USP. And the minimum value of the assets you must have at the beginning to start an IREIT is 300 million. Did I say the one for DREIT is 100 million? I should have. I want to touch, talking about, having talked so much about structuring, I want to touch a bit on REITs governance. And I know the last time we talked about this, I did not talk about this, but it's important and becomes more and more important as we see more and more REITs in the market. We need to remember REITs units are securities issued to the public, and therefore, and this is whether they're listed or they are not, they are securities issued to the public. The moment you go to the CMA, your REIT is approved, you issue those units to the public, then you become an issuer of securities to the public. And therefore, the Code of Corporate Governance Practices for issuers of securities to the public of 2015 now applies to you. This code operates on the basis of apply or explain, which means you either apply the principles in there and recommendations, or you explain why you're not doing that, and the CMA will watch on you to see progressively what your plan is for applying those principles. I will not say too much about this because I have my views about the code and whether it's mandatory or not. It isn't mandatory as far as I'm concerned, but you have to take it into account. You have to apply it. If you don't apply it, to the extent that you don't, you've got to explain to the CMA. Now, of course, it's tailored for companies. And that's part of where, as a REIT, you have to say, okay, this doesn't apply to us. We are only a trust. A trust, we are not a company. So you'll find there will be certain things that do not apply to you. What are the specific things that you need to consider as far as REITs governance is concerned? One of the things is what we said earlier, the independence of the trustee from the REIT promoter and the REIT manager. That is absolutely critical. However, I've got that second last bullet which talks about self-managed REITs. Self-managed REITs, and I've got to correct that bit where I said independent director as chair. That is not correct. Self-managed REITs under Regulation 54 means that a trustee of a REIT can apply to the CMA to be allowed to manage, therefore be the REIT manager of the REIT. That is contrary to everything we've been saying about independence of the REIT manager from the REIT trustee. Because in this case, you're saying when it's self-managed, the REIT trustee, remember who is the REIT trustee? The owner or the representative of the owners of the units. Then they can apply to have the REIT managed, not by themselves, by their wholly owned subsidiary. For example, CoBank, which is the REIT trustee of all the REITs in this country so far, can go to the CMA and say, for various reasons, we now wish our wholly owned subsidiary to be the REIT manager of Fahari Ilam, or Ilam Fahari IREIT. CMA will have to consider various things set out in Regulation 54 and find that it's appropriate to allow the trustee to self-manage a REIT of which they are the trustee. It's not been done. It can be done. It's in the regulations, but they are very, very, there's a huge criteria at Regulation 54 for that to happen. Moving on, the auditor must be different of the REIT. The REIT must have an independent auditor who must be different from that of the REIT promoter and the REIT manager and the REIT trustee. Now again, we only have top 4, top 5 in Kenya. That's a struggle. But part of corporate governance is to ensure that this auditor who reports to the trustee on behalf of the unit holders and reports to the unit holders is different from the one who audits the promoter, who audits the manager, REIT manager, and who audits the REIT trustee. Of course, one of the requirements of the auditor is to report to the trustee and to the unit holders on the compliance with the regulations. So they not only look at the books of accounts, but they also look at the whole list of regulations and they report as to whether there's compliance with those regulations as far as the REIT is concerned. And then, of course, the auditor is appointed by the trustee and can be removed by the unit holders or by the trustee. Now, of course, the role of trustees is an interesting one because they chair the general meeting of the unit holders because they represent the unit holders. One of the things that happened when we started with the Standib Fahari IREIT was a whole confusion. You go to the AGM and the question is, where are the directors? And of course, there are no directors. There were directors of the REIT manager, but they were not the ones who were attending that meeting. They wanted to see directors' pictures in the report. Yes, you put the pictures of the directors of the REIT manager and of the REIT trustee, and then somebody appears from the REIT trustee and chairs the meeting, and they're asking, who is this person? It was a bit cruder than that, the way it was asked. It was, who is this woman? Because she's not a director, she's not our chairman, you know, just somebody from the trustee, deputed by the trustee to come and chair that meeting as a representative of the trustee. And it was a bit of education by the time REIT unit holders got to understand these are a bit different from a company. So, critical role in chairing. General meetings must be held within 120 days of the year end. Companies have a lot more luxury than that. Now, I want to talk about the issue of related, where the REIT manager is related to the REIT promoter as part of corporate governance. You're required to ensure that the REIT manager has at least 2 independent directors, one of whom is the chairman of the REIT manager. If the REIT manager and the REIT promoter are related. Remember, those two don't have to be independent. But if they are not, then the REIT manager must have at least 2 independent directors, one of whom will be the REIT manager. I think you can audit as to whether the REITs you have in the market are seeing to that. Another thing in corporate governance is, can you manage more than one REIT? Yes, you can as a REIT manager with special permission, special authorization from the CMA. Again, we want to ensure, I think, for example, the 2 Acorn REITs are managed by the same REIT manager. We want to see there's no contamination between the two. And the manager is keeping an independent mind. And the CMA has taken into account in permitting them that they are capable of acting independently as between the 2 REITs. And the trustee, who is the same one, again, is capable of keeping their mind separate. That I'm dealing with Acorn D-REIT and I'm dealing with Acorn I-REIT. And I'm not going to be influenced by my being trustee of Acorn D-REIT in deciding whether or not to buy the hostels of Acorn D-REIT as Acorn I-REIT. Tuko pamoja? Yes. Let the hearer hear. Conflicts of interest. Again, these dealt with. We must be very careful about conflicts of interest as part of corporate governance in the REITs. Valuation is a conflicts of interest management tool. Again, the valuer must be independent of course, the REIT manager and the other parties. Must not be the person who was valuing those properties just before they came into the REIT. Okay? And then there are various other requirements where we need opinions by independent experts. So keeping things separate, keeping things in the right boxes. Then there's a lot of detailed reporting as far as REITs are concerned. Strict timelines, 1 month after half year, very, very aggressive. 3 months after end of year, very aggressive. AGM by the 4th year. Distribution, 4th month. Distribution by the end of the 4th month. Extremely rigorous timelines. REIT manager, REIT trustee governance is, because they are licensee of CMA as intermediaries, their corporate governance is governed by the capital markets, corporate governance, market intermediaries regulations. And they must observe those, including independent directors and so on and so on. The REIT manager is generally a regulated person. No, actually this was meant to be. REIT trustee is generally a regulated person, either insurance, subsidiary of a bank, and so on and so on. So really highly regulated to make sure that corporate governance is intact. Now, we must realize this, and unit holders are permitted, of course, to question that. What I've done there is to put a list of all the applicable regulations, various other regulations that one can look at, the laws and so on, which tell you where do I find things about structuring, about governance of REITs. And that is a repeat slide. I cannot go without showing it to you. I'll not read it for you because Mr. Ngong also repeated it for you. But those are the services you get from a very good lawyer when you engage them as your REIT legal advisor. And I'll let my colleagues come up so that we can answer the questions later. Thank you very much.